Welcome to our Thursday IRP seminar. I'm particularly excited to introduce to you Monica Bell. Monica is an associate professor of law and sociology at Yale. And I think it's a nice circumstance that we heard Jessica last week and we're hearing Monica this week because they're talking on somewhat similar topics. She's going to be talking to us about policing and residential segregation toward a research and policy agenda. I am going to hand the presentation over to her. She has said that she'll take questions along the way in the question and answer. So you can feel free as you're listening to type in your question. I'll monitor it as well. And, at the end, we'll take questions again for points of discussion. So Monica, we're delighted to have you here, especially since we're all sitting in our houses in a snowstorm. So it's good to have something to do. And I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for inviting me to participate in this seminar. I'm a long-term fan of what you've been doing at IRP. What I'm going to share my screen in just a second, and I will do my best to manage also looking at Q&A at the same time. Let's see. Okay. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some work that I've been doing recently, and there's a through line through it through an article I published in NYU Law Review called Anti-Segregation Policing. That will be the primary focus of what I'm talking about in this paper. But what you see, and I'll say a little bit more about this shortly, but what you see in the bulk of the article is really an invitation in a lot of ways for greater social science research on some of the dynamics that I discussed that link policing and residential segregation. I'm going to move through the conversation now. So just as a starting point, a lot of my work over the past several years has focused on a dynamic that I've called a legal estrangement. So in an article published in Yale Law Journal in 2017, I discussed legal estrangement as an alternative way of talking about some of the problems of distrust between police and marginalized communities of color. And part of the impulse behind the legal estrangement concept is to reframe the conversation from one where it's just like, oh, there's a problem. These people, these individuals don't trust the police, but instead examine how multiple interlocking institutions produce a sense of group exclusion. So there are two key moves there in my estimation. One is to move away from individualist conceptions about distrust or trust of the police. And I know there are already pre-existing theories. I think legal cynicism does a good job of not framing the question as just being individual and instead focusing on neighborhood ecology. But a lot of theories like legitimacy of the police and procedural justice tend to have much more of an individualistic view. So one of the main conceits of the paper is to really tackle the procedural justice concept. So the group piece is one piece. But in contrast to the legal cynicism perspective, the other big piece of legal estrangement as a concept is to focus on how institutions produce senses of exclusion, to understand that these institutions are interlocking. And so that's what a big part of the reason for focusing on residential segregation is. And so here in this strange graphic that I need to find a better way of presenting this concept. But here, what you see here is a bundle of institutions that are at the center of society and really defining the social community. We can think about law as this line that's kind of encircling some bundles of people and also these institutions. And the work of the institutions is kind of the exclusionary work. So so pushing out certain groups or people. And so this framework is important for understanding why. In a lot of my work, I am interested in examining the relationship between police and other social institutions that we typically don't think of as central to the work of policing, or even kind of the functions, the basic functions of policing. So that's just a little background, but now I want to talk specifically about policing and residential segregation. So in this talk, I want to first talk about the persistence of segregation. Then I'm going to say a bit about mechanisms of what I call pro-segregation policing. And that's really where you get into the hypotheses as I would frame them here. Third, I'm going to say a little bit about anti-segregation approaches to policing and kind of policy changes or practice changes that you would imagine flowing out of a commitment for police to not perpetuate residential segregation. And then I'm going to say a little bit about some connection to some ongoing projects that I am working on right now. Okay, so first, the persistence of segregation. One of the really important parts of having conversations across disciplines. So, you heard that I'm in law school and I'm also a sociologist. So as a sociologist, and particularly someone who focuses on urban sociology, one of the main challenges in working on this policing and residential segregation project was talking to legal scholars who ask questions like, but why do we care about segregation? And I guess there are two questions. One is, do we really still have residential segregation? If you read the anti-segregation policing paper, I spent a lot of time, highlighting a lot of work in sociology that shows some of the changes in residential segregation over the past several decades. So it's not that residential segregation has concluded, which is what, if we looked at some work by economists in particular in the early 2010s, there was a lot of work that talked about the end of segregation, looking at dissimilarity indices and the kind of traditional metric comparing Black and non-Black residential segregation or separation. So I spend some time in the paper talking about why that metric is quite limited. And I do that in part because there has been legal scholarship that has taken that seriously and then sort of imagined what all of this means for our civil rights agenda and like the way civil rights legislation works. So part of the paper does that, but I think the more important part of the paper for this audience is to spend some time, I spent some time in the paper reframing what segregation actually means and explicating what the problem with it is, which often in our sociology conversations we don't discuss. So first, of course, what we mostly discuss in sociology is separation. So the uneven geographic distribution of ethnic groups across a coherent geographic area. I promise I won't read you slides for most of this talk, but I just wanted to, so that's one of the key pieces of the definition of segregation. Separation is of course a part of it. That's what we get a sense of through things like dissimilarity indices. The second key part, and this is another piece that we spend a lot of time talking about in sociology, is concentration. So here I define this as movement of marginalized ethnic groups into identifiable and stigmatized enclaves. So we can of course think about, people like William Julius Wilson, et cetera, who have, Rob Sampson, people like that, who have spent a lot of time writing about the concentration of poverty and marginalization and interlocking systems, and interlocking modalities of disadvantage within particular geographic spaces. That's part of the reason that that's part of what segregation fundamentally is that. But it's important to distinguish from your separation because of the two dynamics that I talk about later in the later here, which is subordination and domination. So why subordination? So this is the piece of the definition that talks about the reproduction of hegemonic racial hierarchy. And it's very important to analyze segregation through that lens, in part because, of course, separation for some groups and in some contexts can be a strategy of power. And we wouldn't want to place separation that flows from the empowerment of marginalized groups in the same kind of normative and analytic frame as separation that flows from the subordination of groups. Now, of course, most residential segregation in the United States is of a sort that has been designed to be marginalizing, but there are some exceptions. So I write in the paper about the Native American community, and although Native American reservations tend to face much disadvantage, the commitment to land and to ownership and territory in a Native American context is of a sort that it would be strange to analyze Native American reservations through a similar type of lens that we would apply to certain types of marginalized Black communities and urban spaces, for various reasons. But I'm happy to say more about that in Q&A. And the final piece here is domination. So, and I'm thinking here about some of the work of Matthew Desmond and Nathan Wilmers actually have a piece, an article in the American Journal of Sociology that talks about exploitation as being critical to understanding some of the issues around housing in America. And in many ways, this focus on domination, so who actually benefits from segregation, is critical to understanding what segregation is. So it's a system through which certain groups are subordinated and other groups gain social advantages. This might seem kind of elementary, but for some of the reasons I just mentioned, it's very important to highlight these dynamics as being fundamental to analyzing segregation, because we rarely have such a normative frame for a lot of the social science work that we engage in around segregation. So I've spent a lot of time on that one slide. So I'm going to move on now to talk more about what I see as the heart of this paper. I needed to do this work up front in order to explain why I was even talking about policing and segregation, but now I want to talk about the mechanisms of post-segregation policing as I articulate in the article. And in the interest of time, that's in the paper, I talk about 6 different mechanisms. And I think key here is that, what are their mechanisms for? They're mechanisms that link policing and residential segregation. So I want to be clear that I'm not making some kind of claim, and maybe this is just too obvious to mention, but I just think it might be helpful to make clear that I'm not making a claim that policing causes residential segregation in any sort of measurable way. I think that would be a very strange sort of claim to make. What I'm trying to do here is, and I talk about this a bit in my recent article in the American Journal of Sociology called Located Institutions. What I'm trying to do is to examine all of the kind of institutional pay-ins to systems of residential segregation. Yeah, so this is a great question from John Easton that I'm gonna come back to, all right. Okay, and also my mouse is being strange. Okay. Maybe I'm actually not that good at managing Q&A during the talk, but I'll come back to that question. I'll
just say, Monica, that I'll be happy to monitor it for you. So you can let it go and I'll jump in if there's something that needs to be immediately addressed. And a great question from John, but he's happy to wait to hear about it later. So.
Yeah, my mouse is too sensitive to trying to manage all those windows and Zoom at the same time. So in the paper, I kind of set out these 6 different potential mechanisms: mass criminalization, patrolling borders, coordinating with other bureaucracies. And so you might think about that as third-party policing in certain ways, constructing jurisdiction, constructing neighborhood reputations, and distributing racialized economic value. So I'm not going to talk through all 6 in great detail. I'm going to talk through 3. So the first I'm going to focus on is patrolling borders. And this might be the most intuitive of the mechanisms that I talk about in relationship to the perpetuation of residential segregation through policing. And that's, so in the paper, I give the example of Richard, who is a young man who was part of a study I led in Baltimore in 2015. And so Richard was an 18-year-old, and he was telling the story of going out and, to this suburban area. He went to go visit some friends. It was the summertime. He was with a group of friends, and it was just, we know unstructured summers and how they can often lead to adventures of walking through different places and just kind of, killing time. And so Richard was out killing time, as young people do, with his friends after they visited another friend, and they also didn't have other transportation back to Baltimore, so they walked. And they, in their walk, kind of happened across a neighborhood where it's a ritzy neighborhood, a ritzy white neighborhood, and they had never encountered this neighborhood or anything much like it before. And so they went in and started walking around and seeing what it was like. So we have a quote here from Richard, who, says, it was so amazing. They had pools and stuff. We didn't know pools was out there. We didn't know how nice it was. So we was just looking around, just looking, just roaming the streets, just looking at everything. So they were really engaged in wonder. And so they talk about, and Richard actually in particular wants to be a realtor. That's his long-term career goal. So he was very excited to see these homes. The person who interviewed him, he offered to help her find a home. This is something he was very excited about. And he sat down with his group of friends. They were kind of stopping, looking around, And of course, we can imagine this is an essay about policing. And so you can imagine what happened. Some neighbor becomes suspicious, calls the police about seeing this suspicious group of Black boys in their white affluent neighborhood. And a police officer goes to question them. So the police officer shows up. She's a woman. Richard talks about, her being, polite when she actually encountered them. But before she encountered them, they were very afraid when they saw a police car roll up. And in fact, Richard says he told his younger cousin who was with him, "Don't worry, I got you. If they have to take someone, I'll make sure they take me and not you." So they were really ready and prepared for the onslaught of the state in disallowing them from being in this space. And the officer goes up to them, is actually, quite polite, asks them for information about what they're doing, does find out information about them, but they have no records, and so they just go on their merry way and they leave. And in a lot of policing literature, especially the way that the police officer interacted with them, as Richard described it, would meet the definitions of what people call procedural justice. So the officer was polite. She explained why she was engaging with them, and really nothing else happened. And she didn't say they had to leave. Nothing like this. But the message was sent. And so one of the key points I'm trying to make in this project about residential segregation is the message was sent to Richard and his friends that they didn't belong there. They were doing nothing. He was telling us this story because it was an encounter that made him feel uncomfortable and unwelcome. And it has that sort of symbolic effect, even though there is no no technically unjust policing. I mean, there is, racialized suspicion by private people, but there's no actual, no police officer behaved in a way that was out of sync with their training. So, but because police are kind of playing in this role of being the kind of guards of white communities when residents call, we see this patrolling of borders, and it perpetuates residential segregation in my argumentation. Okay. The second mechanism I want to say a little bit more about is constructing neighborhood reputation. So what do I mean by that? It's that policing is a pathway through which certain communities gain reputations for certain styles of policing. So I give two examples of this in my paper. So one of these is based on a study I was part of in Dallas and Cleveland, in the Dallas area. And so this is a young woman I interviewed, Jennifer, who was looking for a home kind of in the Fort Worth area, and was told that Mansfield might be a great place for her to look for, for her and her husband to search. And Jennifer is Latina, and so is her husband. And so Mansfield is known, it has been ranked as one of the best places to live in the country. So when she heard that it was a good idea to go look there, she did. She actually found a house that she liked. Her sister, who's also interested in looking for a home, also talked about looking for a home there. But then they started to ask other people about Mansfield, other Latinx folks, and what they were hearing was that, in the quotes here, Jennifer says, they said that the Mansfield police were like, pretty tough. So knowing that, and then she kind of steps back and says, and when I mean tough, I mean kind of like racist. So this is the reputation that, according to her, the Mansfield police had, particularly against people who appeared to be Latinx or Black. And this type of reputation is built on a notion of policing. And so even though she found a home she liked, and even though this is supposed to be one of the best places to live, Jennifer knew that it wasn't for her. Another really key strategy through which policing solidifies neighborhood reputations is actually through crime reporting. Now, so, those of us who focus a lot on policing understand that mechanisms of policing and practices of policing have changed a lot over recent decades. So, and also the way crimes are tracked has changed much with respect to the technology that is used and the data collection devices. And so because policing and data collection has changed, crime reports have become a critical piece of information that people who are moving to certain communities and certain neighborhoods, it becomes sources of information from them. And there are private entities like these crimereports.com types of entities and other private websites that score companies. And there are also kind of in certain jurisdictions, there are available police reports. So I mention this because in the fair housing context, there's a prohibition on what we call residential steering, which is realtors and real estate professionals steering home seekers to certain neighborhoods on the basis of race. Critically, that on the basis of race has also been interpreted to include codes for race, like crime. So there are a number of realtor magazines and real estate professional circles that actually talk about, if someone that you're helping to find a home ask about the crime level in the area, instead of you telling them about the crime, direct them to the police department or direct them to one of these websites so they can learn about these bundlings of crime. And so one of the conceits of one of the points made in the paper is that these crime reports might in some ways kind of provide mechanisms of skirting around fair housing obligations and our fair housing commitments. And so the third and final piece of this, this bundle of 6 that I'm going to talk about in this talk, although I'm happy to talk about any of the others, is to me one of the most important, which ties back in many ways to where I started the conversation about the importance of domination, a domination lens on segregation. So distributing racialized economic value is another way that policing contributes to residential segregation. And so I'm going to give a couple of examples. So one of those is based on research in Cleveland. So I mentioned this large team research I was a part of in Dallas and Cleveland. And so one of the Cleveland couples, Anne and Ron, this is a white couple who live in a suburb of Cleveland called Lakewood. And so they're just talking about how amazing the police in Lakewood are, how and in fact, when we asked Anne and Ron, and Anne in particular, so what is it that you like about living in Lakewood? The third item on the list after something, bike paths in grocery stores, was the police. And so, and this quote is part of that answer. So Anne says, the police are amazing. When we had issues with the neighbors, or there was an accident that we saw outside, or there was a line down outside, immediate. Our taxes go to great use. And then Ron chimes in and says, they're high, but we get what we pay for. Now, what should you be noticing about this quote? So first, issues with the neighbors, an accident outside, or a power line down outside, that's what she means by a line. None of these typically are, well, none of them have anything to do with violent crime, right? So, I mean, you could plausibly make some sort of argument that issues with the neighbors could escalate into a violent situation. But these are not typically what people think of as being core functions of police, unless you're a policing scholar. So, if you've read varieties of police behavior, you should be recognizing this as what James Q. Wilson called the service model of policing. But this is really an asset that Anne and Ron feel that they get because they pay such high taxes being in Lakewood. So they're really paying for this type of service. And so it really commodifies policing rather than making it a pure kind of public good. Another example I talk about extensively in the article I mentioned is in Dallas. So I was interviewing this affluent white woman who's in her mid-40s, whose pseudonym is Anna. I was interviewing her, and she started talking about how she has her local police officer's cell phone number. And I was like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And over the course of our conversation and through subsequent research, I learned that Dallas has a program called, sometimes it's called Expanded Neighborhood Patrol. It's often also called Extended Neighborhood Patrol, but ENP is the program. And it's essentially a way that well-to-do neighborhoods in Dallas County pay for what people think of, really as community policing, kind of like the ideal of community policing. What do I mean by that? So households can contribute some amount of money each quarter. Sometimes, if you really want a lot of police hours, it might be $400. It could just be $150, but it's some amount of money that the homeowners association pulls together and pays the Dallas Police Department. And then so the officer who would normally kind of be their officer and patrol their area, they get extra hours from the officer. They get this special cell phone number that Anna told me about. They also can get services like a safety audit of your home. You can also get things like if you're out of town, the officer might come by and pick up the mail so it never looks like there's no one at home. These types of really granular services, and this all there kind of written out in the ENP manual. And so this is and as I discussed in the paper, this type of additional service through the public fisc in a lot of ways, people know about it, and actually becomes a part of real estate logics in the county. And so this, I discussed this in even greater detail, of course, in the paper. So this kind of distribution of racialized economic value is something that police participate in. Now, what's the incentive behind that? I'm going to say a little bit more about it, and I don't talk about this much in the paper. So we know that police departments are often trying to find ways to get officers greater compensation. So there's police officer overtime. So Seth Stoughton's a scholar who's written about this as moonlighting, how police do a lot of additional safety work, work as guards, and it's sort of a capitalization off their role as police officers, but through private mechanisms. So the relationship between public and private policing is quite porous. What I think is most interesting about this is that it's really doing what we think of as core police work with some additional perks. So it's not, working, overtime as a guard at a football game or something like that. So at any rate, I think these are really, really important mechanisms to shine a light on. So what does all this mean for what one might do? So I want to again highlight here, just to reiterate, that the pro-segregation policing approaches I'm talking about here need to all be studied in greater depth. That's actually why I wanted to give this talk to this audience, because I think I talk in the paper about a lot of qualitative research and draw on some of my own qualitative research to shore up these points. But I suspect there are much bigger phenomena that can be captured in even greater detail and granularity. So with that, I want to move on to a few anti-segregation approaches to policing. Now, I want to be clear, and if you ever get a chance to read the article, you'll see this kind of strange coda where I discuss whether it's even possible to have anti-segregation policing. And I suppose it's important to address now the fact that a lot of the Black Lives Matter agitation, particularly in summer 2020, but of course this is before, and of course it certainly endures. One of the core questions, one of the things that's really exciting to me as someone who cares about promoting racial justice is actually having real conversations, I think for one of the very first times in police reform, about the proper role of policing in society and what it actually looks like to create public safety, and really whether the institutional dynamics of policing are so fundamentally broken that it's not possible to have just policing. So do we have to leave a reformist framework altogether? I think those are really, really important policy questions. And I'm happy to talk more in Q&A about more about what I think about them. But the part of my thoughts, as you'll see with this anti-segregation policies and practices, is a lot of what I'm talking about will feel very impractical. Some won't, but some kind of does. And that is in many ways by, not so much by design, but the point is to articulate what it would actually mean to have some anti-segregation policies and practices in policing. And the fact that some of them seem quite pie in the sky, and while some of them seem achievable, is I think telling about what we think policing actually is and what the politics are around surrounding it. So so one of the points I make in the paper ties back to fair housing laws. Now, of course, you won't have well, I'm not going to say of course. It would be difficult, I think, politically to achieve having fair housing laws apply to police in the same way they apply to real estate professionals. However, some of the core motivations around policing and also through Obama era interventions or attempts at intervention in neighborhood inequality, focused not just on real estate professionals, but also all the institutions that that make neighborhoods what they are, and tried to bring them into a holistic conversation about neighborhoods. And so I'm kind of making a similar type of argument about the potential ways of bringing policing into more of a fair housing ethos, even if the law doesn't tell them behave in certain ways. So especially, with the new Biden administration, and with finally maybe being able to enforce some of the mechanisms that HUD was pursuing around the commitment to affirmatively further fair housing. So HUD AFFH rules. Now that those higher standards are likely to be able to be put in place, part of cities' plans could be bringing in policing and talking about certain police practices that promote segregation and how to untangle them. So that's part of the impulse behind discussing fair housing laws in this conversation. I'll also say a word about structural reform litigation. This is like one of the more kind of practical implementable suggestions. And so structural reform litigation, or one might also think about these as Section 14141 consent decrees that the U.S. Department of Justice engages in with police departments that have been found to have a pattern or practice of bias. And most of the bias that is focused on of bias, and specifically of violating people's constitutional rights. So most of the violation of constitutional rights flows toward racial bias in consent decrees, and most of the ones that have occurred, but there have been a few that have not focused specifically on racial discrimination. So structural reform litigation directives and the processes of monitoring and coming out of the consent decree demand that police departments engage in a number of types of changes to their policies and practices. And there have been times where what the police department is told to do is something that that may not be thought of as traditionally falling into the police umbrella. So for example, in Portland, Oregon, one of the directives was to work more to help shore up community mental health services, because the investigation discovered that the lack of a strong community mental health services helped shape how biased policing was playing out in Oregon, in Portland in particular. So you could have these consent decrees actually talk about the promotion of residential segregation and the furtherance of spatial inequality as part of the conversation about racial bias in consent decrees, and actually shedding light on residential segregation. And it's interesting to me that none of the consent decrees that have been adopted thus far have explicitly discussed segregation. So I discussed that more in the paper. But the final anti-segregation policy or practice that I want to mention is one that is maybe one that people might think of as more pie in the sky in a way that I think could reveal some of the fundamental issues and brokenness of policing. And so that proposal is strategic non-response. So in the paper, I give an example of Piedmont, California, which is an area that is surrounded by Oakland. And there was a couple that had temporarily relocated, a Black couple that temporarily relocated to Piedmont, and essentially the Piedmont Police Department received many calls about this Black couple. Calls that were saying, oh, well, maybe it looks like she's using drugs when, this, woman was smoking a cigarette, things like this. So basically there were so many racist calls and racially kind of, I'm not going to say I'll say they're racist calls. There are so many of these calls that the police chief said, we're not responding to this. We know who these people are, and we're not going to respond to this call. Now, how is this possible? Piedmont is a very small place, so people were able to get to know the community quite well. But, all the time, if we think about processes of dispatch, all the time, dispatchers are making choices about how to prioritize and list certain calls as higher ranked or lower ranked than others. And so certain types of calls may not actually need response at all if they seem to have the trappings of no actual danger. I think about this often in the context of Elijah McClain and what happened to him. And if you listen to that 911 call, it's just not really clear why anyone ever had to go there. He was wearing a mask. The caller said it looked weird and he was waving his hands, but he was nowhere near the caller. Like nothing was afoot. There did not need to be any sort of response, but there was one that and we know the results of it. So this is just really a conversation about how to get police to actually stand in the way of private racism instead of merely responding to it. One example I can give of something like this happening is more local to me. So in a neighborhood in New Haven called Fairhaven, there was a community meeting where community members were saying, oh, well, we're saying, oh, well, we're worried about all these dirt bikes, running through our area. Like, we really want you all to crack down more on these like young boys who are riding these dirt bikes. And instead of the police officer being like, yes, I will add that to my list of things for us to worry about, which if you've been to many community meetings, they're usually more of this character where community members complain and police officers say, okay, well, we will add that to our list of things to crack down on. Well, instead, this police officer said, no, didn't say no, asked the residents whether they really wanted the crackdown that they said they wanted, and talked about what some of the implications would be for young men if they started just kind of stopping people for riding dirt bikes and kind of carrying out this mission. And when asked to reflect on whether they actually wanted the type of intervention they said they did, community members relented. And while that is a small example, I do think it is a kind of granular one. It shows, I think, that police don't have to just react to private concerns about alleged violations of safety. They can instead talk to community members about what they actually want in more detail and create more of a dialogue. Okay, so lastly, I just wanted to mention a few ongoing projects that I thought might be of interest. So I think, former Wisconsin person, Donica Gordon, we have been working on some papers related to police districting. So, Donica has amazing work on ethnographic work on police districting in a Midwestern city. And also has, a book project related to police districting. And one of the things that's been really fascinating to me is that police districting, which I didn't really think about much until I read Donica's work, and I talk about Donica's work extensively in the Anti-Segregation Policing article. But there's so little discussion in police districting of anything about community policing or democracy or anything like this, which I found really strange as someone who came up, 15 years ago. I was really focused on electoral redistricting and voting rights and some of the norms and ideas of democracy that flow from that type of spatial organization. So we're working on a couple of pieces related to that absence and trying to bring police districting into more of a conversation about what transformation of policing could look like. The second project I'm going to briefly mention is probably, if I have to identify my passion projects of the moment, some research I've been doing in Tulsa related to, so for the first time I've been doing archival work, which has been interesting, examining police response and kind of policing issues before and after the 1921 Tulsa massacre, the Greenwood massacre. So there's really not been much of a lens on that. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about whether police and whether and how police were complicit in the actual massacre itself, but there's been almost nothing that I can find examining in great detail the police practices of the day. You know, and I think there have been just, you know, mentions of police practices, but not through a real sharp policing lens. And along those lines, I've also been interviewing contemporary activists who have been focused on, you know, police reforms in Tulsa today, as well as the commemoration process for the 1921 massacre that is going on, the centennial commemoration that is happening this year in 2021. So there's a lot more I could say about that, but this presentation is not about Tulsa. The last two projects I'll quickly mention, I've been working on several projects about law enforcement assisted diversion in Seattle with Catherine Beckett and Forrest Stewart. And so there we're really interested in how to, like, what LEAD is. So LEAD is a really fascinating intervention that gained a lot of attention after I would say like kind of the first big national phase of Black Lives Matter from kind of 2014 through 2016 or so. LEAD was thought of as like this great way to divert people from the criminal system into alternative types of systems. But police really played a central role in LEAD and also kind of served as gatekeepers in terms of deciding who could benefit from this diversion process and who couldn't. And in recent months, it's been fascinating over the past 9 months to observe how LEAD has been changing itself in response to the movement, in response to its own members' concerns about letting the police take such a central role. So between COVID and you know, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there have been lots of fascinating changes in LEAD. I'm happy to talk about that more in Q&A if you like. And then finally, I just want to mention a paper I'm working on with Jordan Brewington about that's called Remediating Racist Acts. So we're really interested in day-to-day incidents of racism and how law really provides no sorts of resolution for those. So I mean, I think we've heard a lot about this. It's like there are microaggressions, and then like what types of law or policy responses are there to those? Very little. There's very little accountability. So in this article, we talk about something I've written about in short form called racism response funds, which is this idea that you could have community members come together and take collective accountability for kind of their failure to disrupt routine acts of racism and to sort of help have more of a cultural change kind of response to these routine acts of racism, rather than the typical individual demonization that doesn't seem to produce radical cultural change around these incidents. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll look forward to questions and thoughts. I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Monica. That was a tour de force through a lot of important and great information. So we have two questions in the Q&A. One is from John Easton, and he had said in the chat that he's sorry he had to jump off. But his question's awesome, so we're going to ask it anyway. He says, Monica, this is fascinating. Thanks for this contribution. I'm wondering if you have considered concentration, subordination, domination, and separation outside of urban space, more specifically across rural places of history, rural places by history of racial oppression. So that's his question.
So I wish John was still here. So I actually have thought about this a lot. I'm from South Carolina, so I actually think my orienting way of thinking is actually less on urban places. And I should say I'm from small town South Carolina, not like differences. There could be differences of opinion whether what's small or what's large. But for a while, I have been trying to get a project off the ground in a deep rural South Carolina. It's looking at some of the places that John Easton has, like similar types of places that John Easton has written about. But it's actually really hard to, like, once you're a faculty member, to like pop in for a summer in a Black rural area. Like, so I'm actually trying to figure out how to do this project, which is something I really care about. But to say a little bit more about concentration, subordination, domination, and separation, we actually see in rural Black belt counties, there are many similar dynamics, except it's more spread out and it's of a different kind of nature. So just quickly, in one of the rural counties that I've been focused on, there are places with like one police officer, and often that police officer is white. And so that one police officer, like, it's a kind of like a very, and maybe it's old school way of thinking about how racial oppression through policing looks. So we don't have the same types of spatial dynamics that I talk about in this paper, but we do certainly have similar sorts of racial dynamics that need to be examined in a lot more detail, which is why I want to continue to do this type of work in other settings.
Awesome. We have a question from Steve Cook, who says, when police reform is discussed, there is, I'm sorry, let me rephrase. Often when police reform is discussed, there's pushback from rank and file police or police unions on redefining the role of police. Any insights on ways to get officers to buy into the need for reform?
Yeah, so this is actually something that's quite frustrating to me. So I do a fair amount of engagement with police officers and police departments and police leaders. And one of the things you hear over and over again from rank and file officers and also from leaders is there is so much that police are asked to do that is thankless and that they don't feel totally equipped to do, and that isn't really in their wheelhouse. And they wish that communities would take up more of the work of dealing with some of this stuff. There's actually common purpose on that. But the challenge becomes when it means removing, like, when it means paying officers less, having fewer officers. So of course that raises all the kind of police union stuff. When it comes to changing budgets and things like this. And so I think we need to see more. I mean, there are, we have the whole progressive prosecutor movement. There are police leaders and police chiefs who kind of self-conceptualize as progressive. And I think they could play a really critical role in actually saying, okay, I think we need to, yield some of our power. We need to have those kind of players, and there have been some. So, for example, I'm thinking about one of the police chiefs in Stockton who hasn't quite said what I'm saying here about like cutting budgets and things like that, but has talked about the need for police to take accountability for the history of racial subordination through policing and moves like this. I think those are promising moves in terms of shifting the conversation more broadly. But, this all being said, the hard politics of getting police unions out of this kind of controlling role is a lot more complicated than I've talked about here thus far.
Thank you. I'm just going to note, Jeff, that you have not typed a full question, just one letter. So if you want to type it or have me unmute you, let me know. In the meantime, Monica, so from not someone who's not a scholar on any of these topics, but thinks a lot about policy, I'm wondering, right, so a lot of this is at the community level, but is there a role, or what role would you see, or what, if you could recommend to the Biden administration that they do something, what would it be?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things. So there's a group of policing advocates who have talked about having some kind of federal policing czar type of person who would, and that language is problematic, maybe. But the point, the impulse is to have someone who's charged, who's not part of the DOJ necessarily, but who's part of overseeing multiple types of reform initiatives all at the same time, and helping to create a kind of national, basically trying to create kind of national moments and national best practices. And I think that's really important. So yes, the politics of policing are local. And one of the really important moves that movement actors have been talking about is restoring power to communities that have been dispossessed. However, we also know that policing tends to operate, like policing is like the quintessential example of isomorphism, where it's popular and then like all the police departments say they're doing it, but there's really no, there's not necessarily cohesiveness around that. So I actually think having someone who's, and that's not, I'm talking about a role, not a policy, but you see, like this is I think important. And then there have also been proposed really important pieces of legislation that would create certain types of agency mechanisms through which money that the federal government gives to police departments could be directed to alternatives to policing. So this is one of the major issues in our public safety conversation right now, which is that like everyone's talking about alternatives to policing, but there's no coherence about what those are or ability to scale them up or to evaluate them or any of the number of things that need to happen in order to make these alternatives broadly scalable and a meaningful alternative to policing. So that is actually where I would put a lot of energy if I had some involvement.
Awesome. So I have brought Jeff in so he can unmute himself and ask his own question. So go for it, Jeff.
Thank you. I'm on my iPad and I type extremely slowly on my iPad. So one of the things that struck me from your talk was this notion of strategic non-response. And you characterized it as sort of a pie in the sky thing, but I would argue contrarily that in fact that is by far the predominant reaction of the state to violations of the law. So there's this book that you're probably familiar with called 3 Felonies a Day and a related literature that tries to argue that there are so many laws about so many things that most people are breaking the law all the damn time. And yet the vast majority of those violations of the law elicit no response whatsoever from the state. Has anybody, have you or anybody else sort of thought about this sort of narrower version of strategic non-response that you have in mind and described in your talk with this sort of broader notion of, wow, we have a lot of laws that nobody ever gets penalized or almost nobody ever gets penalized for breaking?
Yeah, so I think, so I maybe should highlight a bit, and this isn't a response to your question, it's like the beginning of one, which is to say, calls for service are a huge part of the policing landscape that are kind of, until recently, have not been a key part of our racial justice conversation in policing. So a lot of racial justice conversations about policing focus on racial profiling and stuff like this. So police act kind of proactively going out and surveilling people. And I talk about some of that in my talk as well. And I think, so when I hear your question, I think about the fact that, of course, police don't respond to everything they surveil and see. that they couldn't, and there are lots of political reasons not to. So we have a strategic, I wouldn't say non-response, I wouldn't call it non-response. We have like a strategic selection. Like police officers, of course, have massive discretion as to what they're going to focus on at any particular moment. That is different from what I'm talking about with strategic non-response, which is to say police maybe shouldn't respond to every call for service. And there's a norm in policing. Like it almost feels like the reason I said it's a little renegade is because when we think about proactive versus reactive policing, this is saying not no, proactive policing isn't good enough. It's to say that reactive policing should also not just kind of proceed without question. And of course, I mean, I think this is part of your question too. There are communities that have received little responses to their desires for policing. That when they call, there's a slow response or no response. And this is actually something that people in marginalized communities, like where I've kind of focused my research interests, talk about a lot, which is the police are ever present, but when you actually do want them to respond to something, they may or may not get to it and may or may not care. And so, of course, this is a problem, but I don't know. I hope some of that analysis and discussion kind of gets to a bit of what you're talking about in your question with the difference between proactive and reactive.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, to speak for you, I think he was making a supporting argument for non-response being logical and seemingly widespread used in many other areas or jurisdictions is maybe the word. I mean, so like there should be a movement that's like, yeah, we get this. This happens everywhere. Yeah. So that's my interpretation of Jeff. I want to take advantage because I know you were teaching this morning and couldn't talk to our graduate fellow program. So I want to just, in the absence of another question from our audience, I wanted to take a minute and ask you if you could come up with 1 or 2 or 3 areas that maybe you're working in, but maybe you're not working in, that you think are prime for graduate students to be thinking about, as they think about dissertation topics and areas of work. So what do you see as great up and coming topics or ideas? And I realize that's kind of a broad question, but.
No, I think there's a lot, I think there's, so one I've already mentioned, which is the alternatives. What are they? I mean, so aside from, funding more work, I think exploring how transformative justice organizations work. There's so little literature on transformative justice. There's like no literature on this Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon that everyone has decided it's time to replicate. Everyone wants to replicate it, but we don't really know what is constituent. So there's not evaluation of it, and that's another type of activity. But I think even just what it is, why it works, and how it's perceived, and all of that is like really a robust area of research that needs a lot more focus. I also think, we're in a time right now where people are trying to think about history and the legacies of histories of racial oppression. And we need much more of a granular focus on what those legacies are and how one might unwind them, and also efforts to unwind them. So there have been efforts, people have talked a lot about truth and reconciliation commissions, but there have been things short of that, that need a lot of study. So I think there's so rich theorizing that can be done there. And this is just kind of like a conceit of my own work. Like I'm really interested in how institutions play kind of functional roles in society that are not their overt. I mean, we know this is like Merton, it's like, what are the latent and manifest functions of institutions? But we need more of that for today, more of that type of work that investigates the latent functions of institutions and what they mean societally. And so I would encourage a lot more of that work as well.
Awesome. I think we don't seem to have any other questions. So I just want to thank you for what was a really outstanding seminar, and say that we're looking forward to, reading more articles and books as they come out from you, and hope to have you back when you can come see snowy Madison in all its glory.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Everyone have a good week. Bye.